Okay, welcome to the second section of the course. We're going to be looking at short-term decision making and what we need to learn about short-term decision making with accounting information is to understand cost behavior. And that's the first chapter that we're going to look at, chapter 6. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go over learning objective 1 and 2. We're just going to look at the basics of cost behavior and predicting costs. And we're going to start off with, it's going to be 3 videos for this, and it's probably going to be 3 videos for each of the chapters. There's just a good amount of content. One little thing that I am going to be doing differently is that you can see over on learning objective 6.2, I have something kind of highlighted in kind of whiteout. And I've decided that rather than go through every question, every homework question, what I'm going to do is do 1 or 2 of the homework questions for each learning objective and maybe leave 1 or 2 for you to get through on your own, because I feel like they're similar enough that if I explain kind of the basics in one, that it might be a better learning experience if you kind of try and work through one without kind of direct demonstration. So for here in 6.2, I'll go through questions number 3 and 4, and I'll leave 5 as an unsolved. Of course, you're always welcome to email me or jump into our online chat whenever you need to. Just let me know. Okay, so cost behavior. A couple of things that we need to really focus on is that we're going to look at, I would say, primarily 2 things, although we're going to introduce a third one here. We're going to look at fixed costs, and we're going to look at variable costs. And so what do we mean by these? We talked a little bit about it at the beginning of the course. Fixed cost is any cost that does not change with the amount of production. That's really how we're going to look at this. So for example, we were talking about a little bike shop. The rent of the bike shop is going to be whatever it is. Maybe it's $1,000, it's $10,000, but whatever the rent is the same no matter how many bikes you produce or how many bikes you sell. And we would call that a fixed cost. It does not change. A variable cost, it does not change with the amount of production. A variable cost does change. So for example, how many bike tires are you going to buy? Well, you're probably going to buy enough to fit out the bike. So if you are building 500 bikes, you're going to buy, 1,000 tires. You need 2 tires. So the variable cost changes with the amount of production. Fixed costs do not. So when we look at these, so you'll probably start off with a little diagram here, but a common thing in what you'll see in the, and I encourage you to also look at the PowerPoints as you go through these chapters, because they are also set up by Learning Objective and they'll kind of help tell the full story. Look at the PowerPoint for the Learning Objective, look at this video, then do the homework, and that should be good. So if we're talking about fixed costs, we also kind of look at 2 other things. We also look at what are the total, so it could be total fixed cost, and it could be total variable cost. In other words, how much did we spend on all of the tires? Or we could look at it for a unit. So for example, if we built 1,000 bikes and our rent was $1,000, we would say, well, the rent kind of came out to about $1 a bike. But you can see where that would change. If we built 100 bikes and the rent was $1,000, well, that would be, oh, well, my rent's much higher per bike. It's still the same total amount, but per bike it's different. And same with variable costs. You could look at total or unit variable cost. And how we start looking at this is if we say, okay, let's have a column here for total, and let's have a column here for unit, and we're going to look at it on kind of a graphing scale. So if I said fixed costs, and I looked at a graph and I said, okay, so this is the amount of units produced, and this is the dollars. So we're looking at, this is the total dollars. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many units we produce. The fixed cost, in other words, for 1 unit produced, the fixed cost is going to be whatever the rent is, $1,000, or if you produce 100. But when you look at it on a per unit basis, so, and this is the dollars. If we say, how many dollars per unit? Well, if you only build 1 bike and and the rent is $1,000, well, that's going to be right here. But if you build, that's going to be at $1,000. In other words, you're going to put all of the rent on that one bike. But if you have build 1,000 bikes, well, so we could say 1,000. Or if you build 1,000 bikes, well, then you're spreading out the rent over all of these bikes, right? So this is what the cost looks like for the unit fixed costs versus the total fixed costs. And we have a name for this. In economics, we call this economies of scale. In other words, you're spreading out your fixed cost over more units. And that, believe it or not, this little thing right here is one of the two kind of key points of this chapter. So if we do the same for variable costs, well, remember, variable cost changes by the total amount that you produce. So let's say the tires cost, I don't know, let's just say they cost $2 a tire. So if you build one bike, well, you're going to start off down here of spending you're going to buy 2 tires and spend $4. And if you build 100 bikes, well, that's going to be $400, right? You're going to buy, so that point would be here. And so in other words, variable costs go up as the amount of production goes up. But that's the total variable cost. If we look at how much does each, if we just look at it on a per unit basis, we would say for the first bike that you built, the tires cost $4. For bike number 100, how much did the tires cost? Well, it also costs $4. So that would be a straight line. So these two items here, we're going to be using them to help us figure out things. The total fixed costs are the same for any production amount, as well as the unit variable costs are the same for any production amount. So if we were to look at this set of equations here, we would say, well, if we had to guess, what is this? Well, if you notice, which costs are the same? The total costs are the same, right? So the total costs are the same no matter what. Well, this is a fixed cost. And you notice that the costs go down with the amount of units. Well, here on cost B, we see that the cost per unit stays the same no matter how many units. Well, remember, that's the behavior of a variable cost. So we would say this is a variable cost. In other words, it's smaller for 1,000 units and it's more for a bigger amount of units. Well, now we come to this one. Neither the cost per unit is the same, nor is the total cost the same. Well, this is the third item that I said we would focus mostly on fixed costs and variable costs. Well, normally, let's say we're this bike factory, normally you have both of these costs. You have fixed costs and you have variable costs, right? Well, what would you do if you combine these two graphs? If you combine these two graphs, you would say, well, there is some minimum amount. This would be the fixed cost line. Well, it really doesn't want to do those little ones. That you would say, no matter how many bikes we build, we're going to have at least that much as far as fixed cost. And then for each unit we build, we're going to add on top of it the variable costs. So you can see it looks like both the fixed cost and the variable cost. And that's what this last one here, this number 5 is this graph here. And we call this mixed cost because it's a mixture of both the fixed and variable costs. And that's the normal cost you get. But normally we break out costs into fixed and their variable components and look at them separately. Okay, so that sort of explanation should help you with the questions for number 1 and 2. And that's the first learning objective, just understanding this fixed cost, variable cost behavior and both the total versus the unit behavior. So let's go on to 6.2. This is 6.2, and we're going to do two questions here, is predicting costs. So all we're going to do is we're going to use the information that we learned in the fixed cost and variable costs to apply it to a problem. So here we have a situation where the total manufacturing costs are $220,000 and variable costs are $45,000 when 15,000 units are produced. What are total production costs when 22,000 units produced? So you notice we've been given numbers at this volume. Oops, let's see. It's not working. Oh, there we go. Boy, it was bugging out there for a second. Okay, so we have, if you notice, we've got this amount and we want to refigure costs at a different amount. Well, wouldn't they be the same, or how would you go about this? Well, remember, fixed costs are going to be the same no matter what the level of production, but variable costs are going to be different. That's what we learned in the last part. So here we've been given variable costs, but we haven't been given fixed costs. So how are we going to figure out this diagram? Well, we need to break it out. So first thing we're going to do is we've been given total costs, 220K, and we've been given the variable costs. And so our total fixed cost, that's going to be 175K. Now, so that's us figuring out this section. Now, if we look at what is the variable costs? Well, we can look at the variable cost because that's a per unit price, right? So the variable costs were 45,000. So these are just numbers we were given, 45,000, and for 15,000 units, right? And that comes out to $3 a unit. Okay. So if we wanted to say, well, what are the, at this level, we already know that the total fixed costs are going to be the same no matter what. In other words, this is saying the rent or whatever your other fixed costs are, this is always going to be the same. We figured that out from just backing out the variable costs. What we need to figure out is what are the new variable costs? Well, we know that the number of new units that we're going to be producing is 22,000. And we've just figured out the per unit variable cost is 3. So this would be 66,000. So you could see where this would be useful of if your boss asks you and you're the managerial, if you're the cost accountant in the company and they're wondering if we ramp up production, what's our total cost going to be? Well, at least you now have a kind of a basic tool to figure this out. So this would be 66,000 plus the total fixed cost, and you would say, okay, it might be this amount. And just as we looked before, because we're spreading these fixed costs over more units, instead of 175,000 over 15,000 units, we're spreading it out over 22,000 units. We might be able to actually lower the price of our product. Okay, so using this, you can get through question number 3. So let's use the same thinking for question number 4. So let's just remind ourselves, total fixed costs have a graph like this. In other words, it doesn't matter how many units you produce, the total fixed cost is the same. And we would say the unit variable cost also has that same profile. It doesn't matter how many bikes you build, the tires are always going to be $4. Now I realize this doesn't quite take into account the real world where most companies would give you a volume discount. In other words, you buy 2 tires, well, they're going to charge you full price. You buy 2,000 tires, they're probably going to give you a discount. But for our purposes, let's just say that it's the same amount no matter how many you would buy or how many you would use. So you might be given a graph like this, and you're only given two numbers. Well, you don't realize it, but you're given volume numbers here too. So you're given two dollar amounts, and you've got to fill in the rest of the blocks. Well, how are you going to do this? Well, you have to use this idea that the unit variable cost and the total fixed cost remain the same. Well, do we have total fixed costs? We don't have that. Do we have unit variable cost per unit? We don't have that either. But can we figure that out? In other words, if I have fixed cost per unit is $2.40, can't I multiply that by 6,000 units to figure out what the total fixed cost is? And that's what we could do. So the total variable cost, well, let's see, we can do it a couple of different ways. Fixed cost per unit, I guess I had it set up to do it this way first. And that comes to, let me get my cheat sheet up, comes to 14,400. So if I say for this particular one, 2.4 times 6,000 is going to give me what's my total fixed cost. Well, we know from this graph that total fixed costs are the same no matter what the volume is. That's like saying this is the rent. The rent stays the same no matter what. All we did was figure out what's the total. So we can now, because we know that total fixed costs are the same across the board, we can fill in these numbers. Now, can we do the same thing with the unit variable cost? So if we know that we have $6,000 total variable cost of $4,200, right? And that's for 6,000 units. Can I divide those out and figure out what my per unit cost is? Well, it comes out to be 70 cents. So here, 70 cents. And we know from understanding cost behavior, that's like saying the tires are $4 no matter how many bikes you build. Each bike will have $4 worth of tires on it. So that's the same with this. Whatever this variable cost is, no matter how much you make, each unit is going to have this much of the variable cost. So now we have this. Well, can we figure this out? Well, sure. To get the total fixed cost divided by 4,500 would give us this number, right? 14,400 divided by 4,500 would give us this number. Ends up being that. 14,400 divided by 7,500 is going to give us this number. And then we can figure out the per unit costs here. So this would be, I'm sorry, not 3. This would be 320. 320. I was looking at the wrong side. And this together is 390. And this is $3.10, and this is going to be $2.62. Now, how do we get the total variable cost? Well, we multiply 0.7 times 4,500, and that gives us our variable costs. And that is 52.50. And then we can add those up as well. And so that ends up being 19,650. This one ends up being 18,600. And this one ends up being 17,550. So the important thing that I want you to look at here is this line. The variable the variable costs stay the same, but you notice that the more you build, the lower the costs go down. The lower the per unit cost. In other words, the more units you build, you can spread the rent out over more units. And that's what companies like to do. That's what manufacturing plants like to do. They like to try and keep their factory at almost full capacity, because the closer they are to full capacity, the more that they can lower the overall per unit price. You notice when we're only making 4,500, the per unit price is $3.90. But when we're making 7,500, the per unit price is $2.62. So if we wanted, $1 worth of profit off this, we'd have to charge $4.90 here, but only $3.62 there. So you could see the one who is using more of the capacity of their factory is going to have a better pricing system. a better retail price. And that's kind of the whole purpose of figuring this out. Now, there is a concept called the relevant range, meaning, okay, what if the factory, we can only produce, this factory would only allow us to produce 8,000 max. If we tried to produce 9,000, well, then we'd have to either increase the space or we'd have to farm out, we'd have to outsource some of it, and therefore our fixed costs would go up. So in other words, these numbers these fixed costs are only valid within the relevant range. That means how big is your factory or whatever the range is. Fixed costs are only fixed over a certain range. Outside that range, they change. Okay, so they do have a few questions, and you know what? I don't know how these get down here. These little, because I haven't written on it yet. But somehow it's like it's bleeding through the paper or something. Okay. So let's just look at this. Why does the average cost per garment change? Which is exactly what we were looking at. Why does the average cost change? Right here. Well, and so this was something about clothes. The average unit per unit, it doesn't have to be garment, it could be whatever the unit, changes due to the fixed costs. Well, if you notice, the fixed cost, just like I was saying, is what goes down. The fixed cost per unit decreases as you spread it out, as you spread the total fixed cost over more units. So the fixed cost per unit decreases as volume increases. That's the key point, while the variable cost remains the same. So, and this is, I don't know how useful this is, but we'll take a look at this. I think it's just cautionary, this last little bit. It's what happens if you use the wrong numbers? Well, so you can see that if we happen to use the wrong costs, if we use the wrong cost per unit on the wrong volume, we won't charge enough. In other words, this 262 is only correct for the volume of 7,500. But what the question is, well, what if we charge 262 for only 4,500? Well, remember, that's not going to cover the rent. So the rent is actually this much, is actually 17,500. If we only applied $2.62 in fixed cost over 4,500, we're actually only collecting 11,790. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to be short. We're going to be short 5,790. We will have underestimated by this much. Okay. We will cover the next set of learning objectives in the following video. As always, email me if you have questions or jump into the online Zoom chat. For details, see Blackboard. Thank you very much.